Before we begin working on our orb, let's take a look at the CircleCI configuration that will be run to automatically build, test, and deploy our orb. Because we're making use of dynamic configuration, we have two configuration files. Our first setup config.yaml file and the secondary test-deploy.yaml file. On every push to your code repository, the config.yaml file will be triggered on circleci.com. Let's take a look at this file. At the top, we're starting with the version 2.1 config file, and we are specifying setup true, which states that we're going to be using dynamic config. We'll come to that in just a moment. We're importing two orbs, the orb tools orb, which is used for a number of orb-related operations, and the shell check orb, which can be used to lint shell script. Taking a look at our workflows, we have one workflow named lint-pack. It has 4 jobs which will be ran before we publish a development version of our orb, which will be tested in the next configuration file, which will be triggered by the continue job last. So first we're going to run our orb tools lint job, which will actually lint the contents of our orb file. At the same time, we'll be packing that orb. That's actually taking the source code of the orb, which is in many different files, and compressing it down into a single YAML file. We'll run a review job, which can check the contents of our orb for best practices. And we'll run shell check to make sure that we've linted any shell script that is used inside of our orb. As mentioned, we'll then publish a development version of our orb, and then go on to continue the pipeline into the next test deploy configuration file. So if all of the jobs from our config.yaml file pass successfully and the test-deploy YAML is triggered, it will trigger the test-deploy workflow. This is the workflow where we are going to run all of the integration tests for our orb to make sure that it's working appropriately. And then in situations where we have tagged our release, we will also be publishing a new version of our orb. Starting at the top again, you can see we are importing 2 orbs. This time we are importing our own orb, the one that we just generated in the previous config.yaml file, and we're also again importing orb tools. In the jobs category, you can see we're defining an example of how we could run an integration test for one or more commands in our orb as an example. So here we've named our job command-test. This could be modified. In this example, we're running a Docker container and 2 steps, the checkout step so that we can check out our code, which may or may not be necessary, and we are running our orb's greet command, which is currently built into the example orb, and we will be changing that in the future. But this is how you can call one of your commands and test to make sure that it's working inside CircleCI. That will be invoked in the test deploy workflow below. You can see the test deploy workflow has the command test job, which can be used as an integration test for any of our commands. We could also put any of the jobs from our orb in here as well, and we'll be adding those shortly. Then we are going to repack our orb, and only in the event of a tagged commit, and you can see on line 40, we are looking specifically for a tag that starts with V, followed by a semantic version. In this case, we will be publishing a production version of our orb. There's a quick overview of the config file, but we'll see it in action shortly, so let's start editing our orb and we'll continue on. We mentioned that we'll be making a calculator orb, so one of the commands that we'll probably want is the ability to add 2 numbers in this example. So let's open up the greet.yaml, rename it add.yaml, and we'll edit the description to match what we plan to do. Our orb will take 2 parameters, a num-a and a num-b. You can take the example 2 parameter out and change it. We'll take the type and change it from string to integer for our numbers. We'll remove the default, which will force the user to provide a value, and we can change the description to the first number. We'll just duplicate that for num-b as well. One of my favorite features of the orb development kit is the ability to include a file within your orb. So we actually use that for our commands. And it's easiest to include shell scripts in our commands and then pass the parameters specified by our users as environment variables. That way everything can stay nice and native shell script, and we can write it in a separate file, take advantage of syntax highlighting, execute it locally, possibly share that code, and shell check it. Here we're renaming our step, and you can actually use the parameter values right here in the name if you want. This will be visible when we view our command running inside the job on CircleCI. And then within the command key, we're going to change the value so that it says to include a script that will come from our scripts directory. And we'll change that to add.sh. We'll rename our greet.sh, and we'll start modifying our source code. In this example, it's very simple. We'll just use Bash's native arithmetic to add the two parameters together, which were imported earlier as environment variables. So we can just access them the way we would in any shell script. Now, if you recall earlier in our test deploy YAML, we were testing that greet command, which we've now changed to an add command. So we're going to want to change our configuration file to reflect our changes. So we'll change calculator greet to calculator add, and we'll give it the two parameters that we want to test out. Here we'll do num a as 2 and num b as 5. We expect to get an answer of 7. So let's go ahead and commit these changes, and we are on an alpha branch currently, and we'll push those up to GitHub, and we'll see those tests ran on CircleCI.com. Through Movie Magic, I've already made the repository public and updated the description to resolve our review issues. So we'll go through the first config.yaml workflow, which will trigger that continue job at the end, which will then trigger our second workflow here. You have test-deploy, and you can see there's our orb pack, but more importantly is our integration test, which was command test. And if we look at adding 2 plus 5, which you can see, by the way, was in the name, thanks to the parameters, we can see that 1, it passed, and 2, it outputted the value 7, which we expected. Now, we could leave it there, but let's get a slightly more realistic example, because we got a job that passed due to the fact that it echoed out something, but really we want to know what was the result that was output, and we want to check that result. So in a real orb, we may be, for instance, installing a CLI, and we want to make sure that it was installed, or we may be writing something to a file. So in this case, let's take the result, and we'll put it in a result text file, and that way what we can do is we can go back into our test deploy YAML file, and we can check after we've ran our calculator /add command to make sure that the result was actually written to a file, and that that result is what we expect. So this could be analogous to installing a CLI and then afterwards making sure that you can actually run -- version on it or something similar to ensure that it has been installed properly. In this example, we'll be using grep to check the contents of the file to make sure that it does equal 7. And remember, this is just in the integration test in our config. It's not actually part of the orb. So we're using the orb to add together two numbers. That orb's command is both echoing the value and outputting that value to a file. And then within our test, we're checking the value of that file to make sure that it is what we expect to get a full integration test. So if we run this again, we now see another step called should equal 7. And there we have it. What I want to do now is add a job to our orb, and in this part there were a few mistakes made, but we're not going to cut them out so that we can go through them and see how to solve them. Now, previously we made a command which is useful as a user can implement a command in any job that they define on their own, which could potentially happen in any environment, which is also sometimes challenging. Sometimes we need to control the environment that an operation is taking place in. Maybe there is a Docker container that has a specific tool that we want to take advantage of. And in that case, we might want to use a job, which is a bit more opinionated. It works at the workflow level and does a lot more of the heavy lifting for the user more of the time. So here we'll create a job called calc.yaml, which will perform any number of mathematical operations on two numbers. And we'll actually take advantage of the fact that we've already defined add.yaml elsewhere. So we'll make use of that in a moment. Here we'll define a parameter called func, which will be the operation that the user wants to take advantage of. Because we know that there are only a limited number of operations that the user can choose, rather than a string, we can set the type to enum and then give a specific set of string values that are allowed, and only those values will be allowed. And we know what those will be, so it'll be add, subtract, multiply, divide. Right now we're only going to be working with add. While we could set a default value, it might be best in this situation not to, so that the user has to explicitly define which operation they want to choose. For the other two parameters, we've already defined them in add. It's going to be num a and num b, and we'll just use those same two parameters, and we'll actually pass them through to the add job in a moment. Because this is a job, we have to specify an environment. In our case, it's not actually crucial because it's a calculator. In your example, maybe there is a special tool, a special Docker image that is required, so you can set that here. In the steps, you can run any number of steps. You may need to run checkout if you need access to the user's code. And then in our case, we're going to use a when condition and have the condition set to when the func parameter is set to add, we're going to run the add command. The add command takes in those two num_a and num_b parameters, which we have copied, and we're just going to pass the value along into the add command. Now, if we go back into our test deploy YAML file, earlier we had the command test job created for us, but we didn't see how to test a job directly that came from our orb. But the process is pretty much similar. We want to run the integration test before our publishing job, and the process is much the same. So we'll just add the job that we created to the test deploy workflow, that's calculator/calc, and we'll add in the parameters that we defined earlier. We want to test the add functionality. We want to pass in the num_a and num_b. We'll use the same values as before. And we need to remember to include the filters, which are important because of the publish job, which has a filter for tags, which is a deeper subject for later. We also want to include post steps, which is another feature of CircleCI, which will let us inject steps after a job has run so that we can run the same should=7 post check step. Now we need to make sure that this job runs before our publishing step, as it's part of a crucial testing job. So we'll add that to the requires statement of the publish job. Once we have that, we should be all set. So we'll go ahead and commit those changes and push them back up to GitHub. Once we get through to the second config that I've made another small mistake. If we read the error message, it mentions that the command key is not permitted. So if we open up our code and take a look at what we did, and we could have spotted this if we had validated our config file locally using the CLI, we can see that when we ran the post step, we forgot to indent the name and command. So we'll go ahead and indent that. That'll fix our YAML schema, and we'll push back up that change. After pushing up the change and the config.yaml file completes, we'll go on to the test deploy, and you'll see now we have a second job called calculator/calc, and we have the same test completing for us.